Good evening, everyone. This is Patrick Donmoyer of the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center, eager to be sharing with you this evening some selections from our local decorated barns here at the PA Americana Fest. I'm so delighted to have been invited to speak. Thanks very much to Dave Klein and everyone else at the Americana Fest. The performances and presentations have been wonderful, and I am delighted to be here this evening. My hope this evening is to be able to share with you a wide range of different aspects of the local tradition, and at the end hopefully I can figure out how to use the software to do some Q&A in case anybody has any. So feel free to throw some questions at me in the meantime through the chat, and I'll do everything I can to make sure I answer those questions when I'm done with the presentation. Many of you are familiar with the site of a Pennsylvania barn. Those who live in Pennsylvania may know that the term Pennsylvania barn especially applies to those barns that were created in southeastern Pennsylvania. They usually have a forebay and are banked into the earth. This is a distinctive form of barn that was invented in southeastern Pennsylvania as a culmination of Pennsylvania Dutch builders as well as English Quaker builders. What you're going to find on many of these barns is that there's a tremendous amount of decoration. In the very center you can see one of our classic barn stars, but just as often you will find barns that have cutout ventilators. You'll find brick end designs. You'll find Victorian louvered ventilators. Many times you'll find livestock murals in certain parts of Pennsylvania. You'll find quite a few of those in Berks County. In parts of Northampton County and Bucks County, you'll see brick ventilators in circular loophole patterns, and all throughout the region you'll also see evidence of graffiti on many early barns. So it's a really exciting thing that we have here in Pennsylvania to see so much art out in the public, right in front of everybody, and available in public spaces for us to explore. What really got me interested in documenting the barns, I began in 2008 to do this in earnest. I had been witnessing them for many years in the region and thought that they were just absolutely spectacular. After I saw a couple barns that were modernized, covered with metal, and also another that had been torn down, I thought, you know, someone really ought to do something to try to systematically document all the designs in Berks County. My hope was to try to create a registry so that I could keep track of these, and even though we know these are private property, many times these are under private ownership, I would try to keep tabs on many of the barns that were decorated in order to make sure that they at least are documented. The fact is, when I first started, we assumed that there might have been fewer than 100 in the entire region. I did a survey in 2008 where I drove every back road in Berks County documenting all of the barns, and what I found was that we had a relatively healthy tradition. We had about 400 decorated barns in Berks County alone, not to count over 100 between Lehigh County and Montgomery County and Bucks County. And the reality of this is that we actually have barns that are added each year through efforts like the artist Eric Claypool out of Lenhartsville, who's notorious for painting barns just south of the Blue Mountain and then also a little bit above as well. And so what we're seeing here is a healthy and robust, diverse tradition, many different artists, many different voices throughout the centuries in this area. My hope initially was to create this registry to help keep track of the barns that may have been disappearing from the landscape, and the reality is there are far fewer disappearing every year from the landscape than there are that are those being added. Many of you are familiar with the site of the classic decorated barns in our region. If you take a very careful look at this particular image, you'll see two features that characterize the Pennsylvania barn. Aside from its decorative scheme, you'll see that it has an overhang. There's a little bit of a shadow in the very front of the barn where you can see that there's an overhang over top of all of the individual stable doors that would have given ready access to the lower level of the barn where the horses and the cows would have been kept. Usually the horses were closest to the farmhouse. The cows were on the other side of the barn. You'll also notice if you see the slope of the landscape, this gentle slope of the landscape, and you follow it over to the gable end of the barn, the gable end is the stone end that you can see. You will also notice that the barn is banked into the contour of the landscape so that by the time you were to walk around this barn, you would see that the second story is flush with the ground, so you could actually drive a wagon or walk into that second story and then use gravity in order to be able to feed hay or straw down to the animals below. Straw was used for bedding, hay was used primarily as fodder. So there was a logic to the way that these barns were developed as a two-story system to support diversified farming. Nevertheless, the most commonly celebrated parts of the barn is not necessarily the ingenuity in terms of how they're put together and all their different roles and functions, but instead the stars. The decorated barns make our barns in this area stand out more than any other part of the country, and they have been celebrated since at the very least around 1900. There were travel writers prior to that time, but starting around 1900 through the 1920s, travel writers wrote extensively about our barns and revealed them to the rest of the country. You can also see, of course, that these barns don't stand in isolation. They don't just stand out in the middle of a field somewhere with nothing else around them. At least normally they don't. Normally they're part of a broader farm complex with a farmhouse and outbuildings like a pig house, like you can see next to the barn in this image. You can also see examples of a milk house right in front of the barn. You'll see examples of chicken houses in the distance. There are outhouses by the summer kitchen, which is the white building next to the farmhouse with the red roof and the white shutters. Many other different buildings here on the site, and this is a classic example of a Berks County farmscape just a little bit north of Virginville. These barn stars on this barn were created by the barn star artist by the name of Milton Hill. He started painting around the age of 14 in 1902 and has become one of the most celebrated barn star artists in the region. He passed away in 1972, but by the time he had passed away, he had been a permanent fixture at that point in time up until 1968 at the Kutztown Folk Festival, and he had painted dozens of barns throughout the region. We'll never know how many barns he painted, but he left his important mark on the landscape. This particular farmscape also shows the way in which the farmstead is actually part of the landscape. In the foreground, you can see the meadows where especially you're going to see the cows were going to graze. Sometimes also this meadowland is where you would actually do your haying in the past, but nowadays people tend to mow the hills for hay, as you can see in the background. You can see that there was freshly cut hay in the background. You can also see wooded areas, woodlots. These are all important parts of a 19th century farmstead, and these are the same farmsteads that are being used today. They might be used in a different way, but they are a part of the living agricultural landscape in the region. I also want to comment that one of the most important things you're going to see here as well is the fact that all of the different materials that are used specifically for the creation of these barns, these materials come directly from the land and they express a relationship with the land. You're going to find that local builders were using locally sourced timber, locally sourced stone, locally sourced ironwork. All of this kind of material is such an important aspect of the identity of these buildings as being part of the landscape. They're not just something that was plunked down out in the middle of a field or out in the middle of a farm. They were not disembodied. They were part of the relationship that people had with the land and the resources that they were using in order to be able to make these buildings and the land that they were respecting and using for their agriculture. So this is part of a comprehensive farm process, and building is just one of the traditions that was being supported by the land. We also have to remember, too, that when these buildings are put up, they were an expression of a community. They were the results of many hands, all working together, people mutually aiding one another. Whenever a barn was going to be erected, you would find that neighbors and friends and family would band together, pool their resources, and help the farm family to get this barn up. Usually there was a timber framer and a crew of people who were more experienced, but then they needed lots of people who could be helping with standing up the individual frames, with helping to get the rafters on. You can see the most daring and experienced people standing at the very ridge, at the very top of this scene. This is a barn from Lancaster County. This is a fascinating way of being able to show that these barns are, again, part of the fabric of our culture and part of the expressions held near and dear to the community. The barn stars also, in many ways, are the icing on the cake. They are emphasizing, in many cases, the stories of particular artists and particular families and the emphasis that those families would place on having their barns decorated. In the past, you find that there were two different words that were used for these designs. In Pennsylvania Dutch language, you find Stana, which is stars, and Bloema, which is flowers. Today, we tend to use the terms barn stars or hex signs. Barn stars is a term that is starting to gain a little more traction as we're learning more and more in the present day about what is and what is not correct about the aspects of the tradition that have been promoted locally. What you'll find is since the 1920s, a lot of travel journalists and a lot of tourist bureaus, well-intentioned of course, were aiming to provide information about the local barn stars, and instead what you find is many times a lot of misconceptions. One of the biggest misconceptions is that these were created by the Amish. The reality is, in Amish communities, generally speaking, they don't paint their barns. You'll also find many people claiming that these designs were put on the barns for the express purpose of protecting from witchcraft. And thus you have the term hex sign, because the word hex means witch in German and in Pennsylvania Dutch. But the fact is that most local people didn't call them that at all. They called them stars and flowers, because if you look at these patterns, you're going to see designs that favor celestial geometry and terrestrial geometry, those that look like stars and those that look floral. And sometimes you'll even find designs that are a little bit ambiguous, where you're going to find both aspects of the symbolism of stars and also flowers in the very same design, because geometry is something that's shared by both. And so you'll see many times eight-pointed stars, like the one in the very center in the top. That's the most common design you're going to find anywhere in Berks County. But the one directly below it, the next large one down, you're going to see is a design by the artist Milton Hill. It's a more of a close-up on his classic signature pattern that has an interlacing border that could look like the movement of the stars, or also perhaps the unfolding of a blossom. And so these are designs that were thought of in the past as being primarily decorative and illustrative of the stars and of the flowers. So this is such an important thing to remember when we're talking about what do these designs mean and where do they come from. There was no one fixed meaning in the past, but what we can say is that they were emblematic of the heart and soul of the Pennsylvania Dutch people who settled on these farms, who built these barns, and who decorated these barns in a way that is entirely unlike any other place in the United States. This is a unique tradition, and one that many local people, of course, are continuing to participate in. It's a living tradition. There's also a geographic distribution to these words Stana and Blume that are originally used in the Pennsylvania Dutch. If you take a look at the middle of this map, you'll see a little six-pointed rosette that's kind of in the very center of this broader region that would include Berks County and Lehigh County, Northampton County, Montgomery County, Bucks County, to some degree Lebanon County, and also Schuylkill. You'll find that Lancaster County has very, very few, except in the northernmost border region where it touches against Berks and Lancaster. And this is such an important thing because the further west and south you go from Berks County, the more you encounter farms that were held in common, especially by members of plain communities, the Amish and the Mennonites. And generally speaking, they do not decorate their barns in the same way that the broader Pennsylvania Dutch culture did. Instead, you'll find that many times they have simple white barns, sometimes with a little bit of green trim, but beyond that, very little else, because they, of course, believe in plain living, and they emphasize that in every aspect of their lives. You'll see, however, that if you are in northern Berks County, southern Lehigh County, and southern Schuylkill County and northern Lehigh County and northern Berks, you'll find eight-pointed stars. This is the most common design you're going to find anywhere in this whole region. You'll also find that if you head a little bit further east into southern Lehigh County, into eastern Berks, northern Montgomery, and northern Bucks, you're going to find examples of stars like the one on the right that have a floral arrangement to them with teardrop patterns and petals that look more like flowers. This is such an important thing that you can see these two basic regions of the stars and the floral patterns. You'll also notice that the further east you go, the designs start to become more standardized in terms of their colors, white and black on a simple red background. It's not always the case, but it is the predominant situation. And if you go into Berks County, you're going to find generally more colored designs, especially in the northern part of Berks. You're going to find lots of different colors. You're going to find yellow, black, red, and white as your most common arrangement, but you'll also find greens and blues and things like that that are oftentimes absent in other areas. Now again, these are just generalizations, and you're going to find exceptions because every individual area, especially today, when people are excited about having their barns painted, they put on their barn what speaks to them. Sometimes they did it in keeping with their area. Sometimes they asked particular artists to paint something that was in keeping with what that artist painted, like the artist Milton Hill I'll talk about later. But many times you'll find people picked something that expressed their personal preference. And that's still the case today, where you find many different types of diverse designs in many different regions. That diversity of designs ranges from everything from colors to geometric layouts, and many times you'll find that individual designs didn't necessarily have a name. You're going to find stars that range from having 2 points to 32 points. So you're going to find a wide variety of different geometry, some that make use of curvilinear patterns, some that are purely angular, and most, if not almost all, and note I didn't say all, but almost all, have circular borders on them. Sometimes these circular borders are scalloped or sawtoothed. Sometimes they're interlacing patterns or just simple solid colors. But you're going to find a wide diversity of designs all throughout the region. Most of these images you see right here are from Berks and its border region with Lehigh. Here's an example of a classic barn from Kutztown University at the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center. It is a classic Berks County barn. You're going to see the classic 8-pointed stars that are so common in this area with little tiny articulations in between the star points, typically crosses or 4-pointed rosettes depending on who you talk to. This particular barn was repainted by Eric Claypool in 2001 and then most recently repainted in 2016 and 2017. I helped Eric to do this work. I repainted most of these barn stars, but Eric also helped on one or two parts, and so did our friend Andrew Shirk. So this is actually a barn that all three of us have touched in one way or another, and we're really proud of it because this is really a classic barn. You'll see that there are arches above all of the windows and doorways. You'll see that there's a scalloped border along the edge of the forebay. This is a classic arrangement. It's typical for what you find in northern Berks County, especially from the Kutztown area heading north. Kutztown is actually the epicenter of this tradition. We find 90% of the decorated barns in Berks County within, I shouldn't say, within the region, 90% of the decorated barns within the region within about 30 miles from Kutztown. Now that is a pretty wide area, but if you think about it, it is the dead center of the geographic distribution of this tradition. And it's also the center, of course, of many important aspects of the celebration of the culture, such as the Kutztown Folk Festival. And I think all of these different overlapping parts of the region's identity contribute to why it is the center or the epicenter in that sense of the local tradition. You're also going to find examples like this one here. You find these four-pedaled whirling flywheels on this barn in Lehigh County. This is a North Whitehall barn. You can see a very different kind of arrangement. You see little hearts above the windows. That's not always so common, but in this case you especially see white on a red background, and this is your kind of stark Lehigh County arrangement where you have a single color used on a solid background. And sometimes you'll also find red on white in this area as well. You'll also see there's a little star right underneath the edge of the peak of the roof of the cupola. A fabulous barn, a nice historic 19th century barn, late 19th century, beautiful example that you'll find in North Whitehall, just a little bit north of Cedar Crest. Here's an example of a Bucks County barn. Now, a lot of the barns in Bucks County are red, just like your Berks County barns and Lehigh County barns, but here's a nice example of a white one with red and yellow and green whirling wheels on it. These are beautiful designs. You'll find them in 4, you'll find them in 5, you'll find them in 6, sometimes fewer petals, and some folks think about this as an unfolding lily. And here's a nice example of a Bucks County barn. Now, one of the things that is so important when you take a look at some of these historic barns is that you'll see that there's more than what meets the eye at first glance. From a distance, you might just see the decorated pattern. You might just see the 8-pointed star in its 4 different colors. I should actually say 5 because this was originally green and yellow in the star, red in the very center, a red stripe for the border, black around the scallops, and individual black rosettes or crosses in between each star point, and then a white background, making 5 total colors. But if you look in the background carefully, you can see that there is something going on that surface. Look very carefully, and you can make out weathered stars. Stars that are no longer freshly painted, but you can make them out because they are a part of the siding. They are something that have weathered into the surface of the siding through the action of the sun and the elements over decades of exposure, and some folks refer to this as a ghost. We actually believe that the term ghost was coined by the artist Johnny Claypool, who is the father of Eric Claypool, who is the foremost painter today. Johnny Claypool painted several dozen barns in the area. We don't have an accurate count of how many he painted because the landscape has changed so much since he passed away in 2004. But his son, Eric Claypool, is still going strong. He's painted almost 100 barns, and I'm really looking forward to being able to honor Eric when he reaches his 100th barn. And we're doing everything we can right now to do a tally of all of his barns. If you look very carefully here, you can see one of these ghosts underneath the surface of this star that Eric painted. Look very carefully. You can see all kinds of linear striations. You can make out that there was once a star that was offset, set downward a little bit from the location of the present star. You'll also make out that there was a different border at one point in time and that the star points were a little bit shorter. So you can actually see that there were three different designs, three different layers of design work on this one star. From a distance, all you would see is typically the painted design, but if you look closely and if you take some good pictures, you can find what they call a ghost. This happens over time because many times the action of the sun, especially when it weathered historic paints, would cause the background to start to erode backwards. It would start to eat away at that single coat of background white. It would wear through it, and especially for the old paints that tended to chalk rather than peel, the solar rays would go through and they would start to erode the wood. The areas like the star itself and the border many times would have more than one color layer painted over top of the background color. So you'd have a layer of black on each of the star points, alternating with a layer of yellow, and layers of red in the very center and red around the outer edge. And so on all of those areas, you start to see that the area that was protected by more layers of paint has a tendency to stick around longer. You'll also make out that there at one point in time were scribe lines. Artists tended to scribe these patterns into the wood. When you scribe the wood, that area gets compressed while the rest of the background starts to weather back. Eventually, those scribe lines pop back out. Might sound a little counterintuitive and strange, but you will see it in all different forms of vernacular architecture, and it is extremely well documented. So it's a fascinating thing to witness all these different ways that the designs become a semi-permanent part of the local siding. Here's an example of a weathered ghost attributed to the artist Milton Hill. Again, Milton Hill was from Virginville. He started painting in 1902. This was on a wagon shed at a barn that he likely painted sometime around 1910, and it's a beautiful example. This has 32 points. It's one of the most complex old weathered ghosts we've seen anywhere throughout the region, and we were super excited to have it as one of our artifacts at the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center at Kutztown University. Milton Hill was known for many things. On the very lower part of this image, you can see that there were three tiny little watercolor paintings that he produced when he was still a student at the one-room schoolhouse in Virginville in 1899, and his teacher was kind enough to be able to encourage him. His teacher's name was Jeremiah Adam, and Jeremiah was not all that much older than Milton because he was a young schoolhouse teacher at that point in time. He encouraged Milton to follow his dreams, and Milton painted watercolor paintings before then going on to painting barns at the early age of 14. The first job he ever did was on his home farm. His father had also painted barn stars, and Milton was asked to repaint the barn that they had at home. And his father was also a painter who did jobs elsewhere. And eventually Milton started his own painting crew, started assembling a crew of people from his local neighbors and friends, and they started painting barns by 1902. By as late as 1910, he was creating the signature pattern that you see here that has an eight-pointed design in the center with a receding layers of a star working their way in towards the center, a star burst, and then an interlaced pattern around the outside. In this case, it's green that you can see above the barn, the historic picture of the barn. You can also see examples of this design that Milton is painting in his studio on the upper right. Milton was believed to have been the first person to paint on commercial signboard sometime in the late 40s. And this is an interesting development because there were two artists who started doing this around the same time, both Milton Hill and his colleague by the name of Johnny Ott, who painted in the town of Lenhartsville, just miles to the north. Milton Hill was a barn painter. Johnny Ott never painted on barns. Johnny Ott instead was a painter of tollware and tinware, and then eventually began to paint commercial signs later on. And the two had very different ideas about how the local tradition was to be expressed. Johnny Ott considered himself to be a professor of hexology, where Milton Hill was a speaker of the dialect and said these designs were just for nice, that they were purely decorative, that to him it was an art form that was about geometry and color and expression. Johnny Ott said, oh no, they're magical. You'll also notice when you look at Johnny Ott's work that the geometry is influenced by the designs you see on the barns, but the coloration and the design elements are entirely different. Johnny Ott really created a new art form sometime around the late 40s, early 50s. Again, we don't have a precise date for this because we don't exactly know when all of this started. Some people have said Milton Hill was first. Some people have said Johnny Ott was first. We don't really know. Johnny Ott claimed that when he first started painting, according to interviews he did in the 1950s, in the local newspapers. He claimed that he started doing this kind of as a bit of a joke, that he did it with a sense of humor in mind, but over time his stories became more and more embellished. He claimed that his designs were magical, that they had the ability to influence your life, that he claimed that people who were having trouble having children would buy his signs for fertility, and lo and behold, all their problems would be solved. He claimed that his signs for sun and rain were were dangerous to be used in the wrong season, because you would put them outside in order to encourage the good weather during the growing season, but you couldn't keep them out too long, or they might result in the flooding of the Delaware, like what supposedly happened in the 1950s. And Johnny Ott had many, many different stories. And the important thing about Johnny Ott was that he was well loved by local people. He was a bit of an outlier in many respects, but the fact was he was a technically a really interesting artist. He produced a lot of work. He was very prolific, and any person who bought his work would also get a story. And who doesn't like a good story to go along with their work? And so it enhanced the value of their interactions with Johnny Ott to buy a piece of his work, to hear a story, take that story home with them, even though in many cases his stories were tall tales. We know he was exaggerating a lot when he claimed that these were Amish. For instance, you can see in one of the postcards above, you see him wearing a flat Amish hat and a tuxedo jacket. He is kind of echoing this idea that the stars were common in the plain communities. You'll also see images of an Amish boy and girl above him. So he perpetuated many things that today we would think of as being some of the post-1950 mythology associated with greater interest in tourism in the area. And this was a time when lots of folks were coming to the region, visiting the region, and buying examples of his work. And his work eventually also influenced this silkscreen painter in Lancaster County by the name of Jacob Zook. Jacob Zook started silkscreening in the 40s, but he really only started doing barn stars and hex sign designs after Johnny Ott introduced them to him in the 1950s. And Jacob Zook was one of the people who helped to popularize this art form by printing literally hundreds of thousands of them that were sent all throughout the world. So when you Google the word hex sign today, 9 times out of 10, you're going to come up with something that is directly related to the work of Jacob Zook. And he copied many of the designs of Johnny Ott. So you're also going to find lots of Johnny Ott there. And this is an important part of our tradition. And it's one of the ways that it has been promoted locally and celebrated locally. However, throughout the region, you'll see the work of many different artists. If you're in the area just to the west of Kutztown, you're going to find a lot of designs by Milton Hill. Also, if you're going to look at the border region between Lehigh, Northampton, and extending further down into Lehigh to where Lehigh and Berks and Montgomery and Bucks all kind of converge, you're going to find that in that valley, extending from Northampton County down to Bucks, you're going to find a wide range of designs that have the influence of an artist by the name of Noah Weiss. Noah Weiss was a folk art carver and painter. He ran a hotel, just the same as Johnny Ott did, because Johnny Ott ran the Lenhartsville Hotel. Noah Weiss ran a hotel in the city of Northampton, and the interesting thing about what he did was he painted barns on the weekends, and his barns can be found in eastern Berks and also in parts of western Lehigh and Northampton, and then also in parts of Upper Bucks and parts of Montgomery. So he really had a wide range, and of course his designs were in keeping with that region, so sometimes it can be hard to tell if a design is his work or someone that copied him or just in keeping with the way that local people did it. Here's an example of one of Noah Weiss's barns in the Coopersburg area. A photograph was taken circa 1950. Now, this term hex sign is controversial because we know that this tradition is centuries old, but believe it or not, the term hex sign is not yet 100 years old, because it is only the year 2020 right now, and this term, hexafus, as it relates specifically to the barn stars, was coined in 1924. Within just a couple years, people had kind of adapted that term, started calling them hex signs, and so really we won't have 100 years of use of this word hex sign for another few years. And the person who perpetuated this term Originally, he used the word hexaphus. His name was Wallace Nutting. He was a congregational minister who had retired and turned to writing travel logs of his journeys throughout the Mid-Atlantic and New England. He did a series of books called the States Beautiful series. He even did one for Ireland, even though Ireland is not a state in the United States. He still included it in the series because he thought Ireland had a beauty that was comparable in many ways to the Mid-Atlantic and New England. He wrote a book called Pennsylvania Beautiful in 1924, and he claimed that the designs on the barns were called hexaphus and that they were markings on or around the door and that they were put there specifically for the purpose of protecting the cattle from witchcraft. Now, he goes on as well in his book to say that his stories contain many romantic accounts. He even goes as so far in one of his particular accounts to say that this isn't a work of history. This is really his response and his romantic reaction to the region. We don't know where he got his information. He was not from the area, and when he started writing this, he was essentially promoting a very obscure term. The term hexaphus, as we know today, was a carving that was typically done on or about doors or windows, so he got that aspect correct. But he mistook the larger designs in the barns for these carvings. The carving was originally in the shape of an upright foot of a goose, and it was put there for protection. This is believed to date back to ancient times. He mistook this old protective tradition for the barn stars themselves. Local people thought that his accounts were verhoedeld, to use a Pennsylvania Dutch word, meaning confused. Nevertheless, his book had wide acceptance throughout the United States, and he was able to get this book into the hands of hundreds of thousands of people, and that's how this term became so deeply entrenched. And within just a couple decades, everybody throughout the United States was referring to these designs as either hex marks or hex signs. Hex marks was a term that was popular in the 30s and 40s. By the 1950s, the term hex sign was so firmly entrenched that most people no longer even knew the term barn star outside of the immediate area where these were being painted. And this is just the way that you can see that culture changes over the years, sometimes for the better and sometimes with a little bit of misinformation. However, we know this today, and so we know better. And many folks today are using this term barn star because, of course, it is in keeping with the old Pennsylvania Dutch dialect words that were so commonly used by the farmers themselves who had these barns painted, and more accurately tells their story. However, this is not to say that there isn't some mystery and some symbolism and some meaning in these designs. There was one author in the 1950s by the name of Alfred Shoemaker. He was the director of the Kutztown Folk Festival for the first decade or so, and he was the founding executive director. He wrote a book called Hex No. He claimed that designs on the barns didn't mean anything, and he did much to inspire his opposition through that. I will not say that they don't mean anything. In fact, I think they're incredibly meaningful. Many times you'll find that each individual star might not have a succinct verbal meaning corresponding to its unique pattern and its creation by a particular artist, but many times these designs, when you look at them, do have a sense of meaningful content for the people who own them. For instance, this particular star in Maxtawny Township has 7 points. Some people thought about 7 points as being a lucky or holy number. You'll see that there are 3 crosses above all of the windows and doorways. Some people thought about the 3 crosses put above windows and doorways as representing the 3 kings. The term 3 kings crosses is very common to find in Europe. If you go to parts of southwestern Germany today, you'll see that many businesses, urban farms and homes, and yes, I did mean that when I said urban farms, because the farms are actually in the towns in many areas of Germany. You'll find that people were putting crosses, 3 crosses, and the initials of the 3 kings, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, right on their properties. And this is a very common thing that folks would do in the Feast of Epiphany. You can see echoes of that in some of the material that you find on the local barns as well. But you'll find especially that these designs are meaningful, not just because of their geometry and because of relations to things like the 3 kings crosses, but because of the fact that these stars followed people through life. You were going to find them in pretty much every aspect of life in the 19th century especially, and of course in parts of the 18th century and even early 20th century. The fact was that folks were putting these stars on decorative date plaques on the house of many of the earliest homes and barns in the region. You'll find them on tombstones. You'll find these types of designs on coverlets along with floral patterns. You'll find them on the keystones above some of the oldest churches in this area. You'll find them in birth and baptismal certificates like the one on the upper right. You'll see them on common everyday tools like the Dengelstock on the right. The Dengelstock is an anvil used for sharpening scythes. On the left, you'll see an example of a chip-carved wooden mattress paddle. Literally from the time that you are born to the time that you die in the 18th century, you'll find examples of stars found on local objects that were incredibly meaningful to local people. And this is part of the meaning of the stars, part of the way in which people valued the stars in the barns as being part of a broader tradition that extended through all different aspects of life. The earliest known barn stars were part of this tradition of date boards and date plaques. You'll find that some of these earliest ones are from the first couple decades of the 19th century, but I found one that was from 1784. And this is a fascinating example from the Montgomery County area. The 1784 one, the one you see right in front of you right now, is from 1819. It's from Berks County, and this example is from the area just north of Lenhartsville along 143. You'll find examples very similar to this in the corridor along the old Kings Highway, which literally ran from the Blue Mountain in Albany Township down through Berks. It extends down into the border region with Lehigh and Montgomery County, and along that corridor is where you are going to find a tremendous amount of these date plaques. So literally from Montgomery County on up. One of the earliest ones in Montgomery County is from the 1780s, and it's on a house along Route 73. The 1784 one, that's on a local barn in the Montgomery County area, is on the border with Berks. So you can see that this was happening over the course of many decades, right around the turn of the century, from the late 18th century into the early 19th century. This particular one has initials and a date, commemorating the Kistler family and probably Samuel and Maria Kistler in 1819. These also echo some of the stones that you might more formally think of as blessing stones in other parts of Pennsylvania. You find some of these in Lebanon County and Lehigh County and Berks County, where there are elaborate inscriptions. Sometimes these inscriptions also have prayers, like the one in the very center, which is from the Troxel Steckel House, which is part of the Lehigh County Historical Society. And it says 1756. It says, Gott behüt dies Haus vor alle Gefahr, für unser Seelen Himmelsal. It is a poetic inscription written by the builder for Johann Peter Troxel and his wife Maria Magdala. The inscription reads, God protect this house against all calamities and lead our souls into the halls of heaven. You can see that these types of inscriptions found on homes and on barns were thought to be incredibly meaningful to local people. Part of the act of formally blessing and celebrating the establishment of a property. Here's an example of one from the Berks County area. It says, Gott kann bauen und abbrechen, kann geben und kann nehmen, jedem nach es ihm gefällt. Heinrich Erz Mauer. And this particular example here says, God can build and he can tear down, he can give and he can take to each as it pleases him. And then it says, Henry Hartz, the stonemason. Mauer is the word stonemason, and Heinrich Erz is probably a spelling of Heinrich Hertz. And the interesting thing about this is that you'll find some examples of these in Berks County that are no longer extant in the landscape. This is an example of one from the Sinking Spring area. The barn is still there, but the inscription no longer is. What we have photographs, and we can determine which barn it was. It's right in Sinking Spring. Beautiful example that was captured in the 1950s. You can even see the electric wires up in the upper portion right after this barn had been electrified in order to be able to provide light and some other things inside of the barn. So this was a modern shot by the photographer by the name of Guy F. Reinert, who took the photograph for the Kutztown Folk Festival circa 1950. This is a good example of the way in which people blended religious ideas into the dedication of their barns, and the way in which these types of designs often accompany these religious inscriptions. This type of interest in essentially either blessing or commemorating the importance of local structures continues in a different way today. Although many people, of course, are not running out to build brand new stone farmhouses and barns, people instead are having those barns and farms restored. And many times what you're going to find is that there are artists today who still go up on ladders and paint these designs. Here's an example of 3 different artists. I'm showing this picture here because these are 3 artists who typically demonstrate at the Kutztown Folk Festival up on a ladder over the course of the 9-day folk festival that this year has been canceled and is going to be held virtually. On the far right, you can see Eric Claypool painting an 8-pointed star, just like one that he repainted up in Albany Township in the year 2007 that we believe was done by Harry Adam. On the lower left, you can see Andrew Shirk, who is an up-and-coming artist. He is Eric Claypool's understudy, and he's helped on a number of local barns with Eric, probably a couple dozen by now. And Andy is also was a painter and was a painter of houses and other things prior to turning to painting the stars. And he also paints discs and is becoming a rather prolific artist. Just above is me. I've done a couple barns. I've helped Eric on a number of things, and I've done quite a bit to help preserve these designs, including talking about the techniques and teaching people at the Kutztown Folk Festival. I really think about this as a tradition that is in the common hands of every person. If you want to paint a barn star, you can find a way to do it. Don't look at the three of us up here and assume that we're all just professionals and that we're the only ones who can paint, or that other painters out there who have commercial businesses are the only ones who paint. It's not true. Anybody can paint, and history shows that many farmers painted their barns themselves. Sometimes they were done by commercial artists and painting crews. Other times it was a farmer who would get up and do the painting. I've talked to men and to women who've painted. This isn't just a guy thing, and it's such an important thing to be able to take a look at these traditions and make sure that they are accessible to everyone as a living tradition. I encourage anybody who has a barn to find a way to have it painted, whether you can do it yourself or find someone else who might be willing to go up there and paint it. And the more hands we have doing this, the more people we have who are talking about the tradition and employing the tradition and doing the tradition, are the more barns you're going to be finding in this region that are going to be preserved. Other thing you're going to find in this area, I briefly just want to mention livestock murals. You're going to find quite a bit of these all throughout the area, and these were the 20th century alternative to painting stars on the barns. In fact, you're going to sometimes find them in concert with one another on the Berks Lehigh border region. Sometimes you find stars and outlines of animals. Many times you find horses, especially for equestrian barns, but oftentimes you'll find a wide range of different animals, and sometimes cows, and sometimes goats, and sometimes donkeys. It really does depend on the farm, and it depends on what livestock the farmer had. You can see in many ways that these types of designs are often done in simplified forms, oftentimes silhouettes or something close to an articulated silhouette. Many different artists. The one in the very center is from the border region between Lebanon and Lancaster. The upper left is from Lancaster County and Earl Township. The one on, or I should say the two that are on the right-hand side are from the Upper Perkiomen. There was a particular artist in that area who was doing a lot of painting, and the one down on the lower left is one from the Upper Perkiomen in the Berks County area. And this is a fascinating tradition because you find it in many different areas. The Berks Montgomery border region artist painted quite a few barns and also some stars as well. And you can see they're very distinctive forms. Oftentimes these are very pictorial with everything from fences and trees and flowers and perspective on the landscape mixed in. Some of these are extremely sophisticated, like these in Fleetwood, just outside of Kutztown. You're going to find that these examples show not only the livestock and the landscapes, but also the one in the very center of the two mules. You can see an airplane flying in the background. My belief is these were probably done sometime shortly after World War II. You can see an airplane in the background that looks like a military plane. I could be wrong about that, but it looks like one to me. Elsewhere on this farm, you're also going to see 8-pointed stars, and they're in keeping with this tradition of sometimes having the livestock murals and the stars together. These were not there, just like the stars on the barns. They were there for decorating and highlighting the activities of the farm. They were not put there for any form of protection or anything like that. The designs on the barns for the livestock were usually illustrating some aspect of what the farmer was doing, some aspect of their livelihood. And you can see that these oftentimes are also mirrored in the types of advertisements that were also produced by local sign painters. Here's an example of one of the Lehigh farm. It says Lecha, the Lecha farm. And this is a mixture of Pennsylvania Dutch for the word Lecha for Lehigh Valley, and then the word farm in English. And this is from Northampton County, and is a nice example showing the brown Swiss cows for this particular dairy. And so you can see some overlap between the commercial painting that was done on on metal signs like this one, and then also oftentimes the designs on the barns themselves. Here's a nice one done by a friend of mine by the name of Joe Johnson up in Lehigh County. And she has on hers, it says, Essity Grumbeere, and literally means eat your potatoes. D is spelled a little differently. Some people would say that's D or die. Her intention was for it to say, eat your potatoes. And this is a regional dialect, so spelling is not standardized. And you'll get this idea from this particular one here that this, of course, is a historical potato farm, and I believe they still do some potato farming. You can see also the way in which the animal of choice here is the American eagle, and you'll see two flags. And this kind of patriotic um, imagery is found on many barns in the greater Kutztown area, and then also in Lehigh County and some other regions as well. This is such an important thing, and I love the fact that this one uses Pennsylvania Dutch language, and that it's reminding you to eat your potatoes. You'll also find cutout ventilators in a lot of these barns as well. These cutout ventilators are wonderful examples of the way in which you'll find other forms of geometry on the local barns. They also had a role. They were there specifically to allow ventilation in the barns to help keep those barns from having any issues from the storage of hay. If you've ever read the newspapers in midsummer, sometimes you read stories about barns that have spontaneously combusted because there was too much moisture in the hay. And for this reason, these cutouts on the barns were thought not only to protect the barn by allowing that ventilation to help the barn to off-gas some of its heat, but folks also believed that these were to admit a bird. So local people many times called these swallow holes or schwalmalecha. That is plural. Schwalmaloch is the word for a swallow hole. And they were thought to admit a bird into the barn, and folks believed that the birds who came to the barn, especially the swallows, which would come every year, would bring the blessings of spring and fertility to the barn, and they would protect that barn from being struck by lightning. It's a well-documented belief here in Pennsylvania, but also in southwestern Germany. You find the very same types of designs. And here's a nice example of one seen from inside of the barn. When you look up at that gable end, you get a chance to see the light shining in from the outside. And sometimes you'll be able to see little birds also perching on the edges of these as well. And of course, you're going to see lots of droppings on the inside as well, because this is where many birds, of course, were going to be perching over the course of the day, sunning themselves, preening themselves, and so on and so forth. Barn graffiti. You're going to find a lot of graffiti inside of barns, and it's controversial because some people believe that every piece of this graffiti was somehow part of a protective tradition. And I have a tendency to think that there's a wide range of meanings for why people were putting designs on the insides of their barns. Some of them may have been for old ritual purposes, just like the hexaphoos that I mentioned, that was an image of an upright foot of a goose put on a barn door for protection. You'll find diamond shapes that were thought to be symbols of fertility, images of birds, also signatures of individuals, starbursts, six-pointed rosettes, lots of different examples. And this is all from the Sheridan Barn at Kutztown University, done around 1855 by a young man by the name of Henry Sheridan, who was the nephew of the builder David Sheridan. And here you can see example from northern Berks County of a granary door. A lot of different graffiti on here. You can see the date of when the barn was built in 1857, along with a wide range of different signatures indicating these were possibly the barn builders, people who took a little time to put some graffiti on this door and liven it up with a date and a name. It's like putting a penny in your cement in front of your house. It's the same idea that folks were going to put their names on this and mark that which they touched. And you can see the touch of the artists in many local barns on the inside. Sometimes folks believe that these designs were put on the insides of the barns specifically to give the artist an opportunity to practice. In many cases, you can find that sometimes the designs on the inside of the barn do not match what was on the outside. And so for me, it's hard to believe that these were put there specifically for practice, but sometimes you can find some similarities. And the eight-pointed star in the upper left is one example where you can find an eight-pointed star inside of the barn and a very similar design on the outside. These other examples up here are entirely unlike what's found on the outside of the barns. And so, in fact, some of these barns are decorated on the inside but not the outside. And it begs a question of why folks would do this, and we'll never really know. But the beauty of this is that there is so much out there to explore, so much for us to be able to see. The last thing I have this evening for you is this wonderful example here of a sundial with a Latin motto. Go figure, a Latin motto on a Berks County barn, Richmond Township. It says, Transit umbra, manent opera. The shadow moves, but the works remains. In this case, it is referring specifically to the shadow of the sundial moving across the surface of the barn as the hours progress, starting in the morning and working its way to the afternoon. And the idea is that the works remain. These are the works of the people who are building the barns, who are working on the farm, who are leaving behind a legacy for the people who are going to come after them, who are going to see their values, see what they did with their time, see how they contributed to the local culture and the local landscape. And this is going to speak volumes about what was important to them and how they lived their lives and how they valued what they had. And I think the barn stars and the inscriptions on the barns are a great example for the way we can explore how important these types of designs were to local people. And last but not least, I want to let folks know there's a book called Hex Signs, Myth and Meaning in Pennsylvania Dutch Barn Stars. I wrote it for the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center, and it is available through Masthof Press and on Amazon. All proceeds from this particular book go to supporting cultural programming at Kutztown University, and I'm so excited to be able to share this with you. We're hoping to do a new edition in the near future, and this is a great place to find some more information about local barns and associated traditions, and I'm delighted to be able to share with you the material that I shared with you this evening. And it looks like my video appears to have turned off mid-presentation, and I'm not quite sure when precisely that changed over, but looking right now at what looks like a blank screen. I see a bunch of different names coming up, some very familiar people. Hi, Chris. Great to see you guys. So many different people saying hello. This is wonderful. I'm so delighted that so many people have said thank you and so many people have said hello. And I'm sorry if for some reason the video cut out at some point in time. My hope is that when I have the opportunity to be able to do this work with continuing a presentation for the Berks, I should say the PA Americana Festival. I almost said Berks Country Fest, but the PA Americana Festival. I will be doing another presentation sometime in the near future on powwowing. Look forward to postings and schedules available on the PA Americana Fest Facebook page. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I really appreciate everybody coming out. I am going to sign off because it looks like the video has malfunctioned, but thank you all for joining me. I hope that the audio is still running, and I hope that you can hear this when I say thank you to you all for joining us and keeping this cultural programming going despite COVID-19. I am extremely delighted that so many folks are interested in preserving local traditions, engaging in dialogue about local culture, and celebrating our region's heritage, despite the fact that many of us are celebrating from home and are not able to go out and do other things that are fun and interesting in keeping with what we would normally be doing this year. So thanks to you all for supporting us, and thank you so much for having me this evening. And as we say in Pennsylvania Dutch, schaff net zu hard und mach's gut. Don't work too hard, and have a good one.